In this lesson, we'll be reducing the mass of our component tray. After completing this lesson, you'll be able to create and extrude. At this point, we're ready to wrap up our design and get the first 3D print. I want to give you a few additional tips, things that you guys can do to make your designs a little bit better or pursue some different avenues. The first thing that I want to do is I want to check on the mass of these bodies. So I'm going to take a look at the X-Star body. I want to see what the current mass is, and we're at 245 grams. If we check on the component tray, we check on the properties, we're at about 80 grams, so 79.2 grams. So we're a little bit over our 300 gram goal. So we're about 20 to 30 grams over that. And that's okay. We're still within a reasonable margin, and there are things that we can do to lighten this up. So that's what I want to talk about here is some of the final steps and things that we can do to either increase the structure or reduce the mass. So we made some drastic changes in the initial shape by adjusting the fillet on the landing gear. And that allowed us to reduce a lot of mass. The other things that we can do to get rid of mass are, again, we can approach this area here where we have that solid section. And because that solid section is actually not providing a lot of structural integrity, we can remove it, we can rerun a simulation, and we can see how it works out. Same thing in this area and all the other four. So we can go back and we can take care of that. If we want to increase the structural rigidity, we can make this section wider. We can make the I-beam offset a little bit thicker, and we can also reduce the amount of material we're taking away here on the top. So those things will allow us to carry that structure in. We could also take the component tray and we could connect it to the motor mount. All right, so this area right here where we have the boss for the motor mount, we could carry that thickness all the way into the component tray, and that would add some rigidity as well. Because right now the entire body is one big wing, and on its own it's fairly flimsy, but with the structure underneath, when we bolt the component tray to it, it's going to add that structural integrity. Another thing that we could approach is adding that extra leg that comes out to this area, and that extra leg could provide some additional structure. And again, it's well outside of the path of the propeller, so we're not going to be doing too much to affect the airflow. In terms of additional modifications, the last modification I want to talk about or approach is removing material from these bosses on the component tray. And that's solely because we have a very close proximity with the propellers. Now, we're not actually interfering with the propellers, but they're fairly close to this, even though they're just above. And this could potentially add some noise. And what I mean by that is as the air from the propeller passes around and hits that corner, even though it's rounded, it will increase the decibel rating, the noise level of the quadcopter. And you'll notice that these things can be fairly noisy depending on how much obstruction is behind the propeller. So I'm going to start a sketch on this face. And what I want to do is I want to remove the material from this corner. So I'm going to take this edge and I'm going to project it. And then we're going to draw a line and we're going to come straight over to the center point. We're going to come back to this point, and then we're going to come straight out and over. So we want to make sure that this is vertical, and we want to make sure that this is horizontal. And what we're going to do is we're going to cut this boss from here. We're going to leave that arc there, and we're going to cut it over here. Now, it's just solid material, so this will actually reduce some of the mass, and it doesn't really affect the mounting location or the bolts or anything like that. So the way that we can approach this is we can use a split body feature, or we can simply complete the profile and we can turn it into an extrude cut. Make sure when you do this that you do still go back and add constraints and you define it, because there could be a case where you come back and you make some modifications and it no longer cuts out the geometry. So I'm simply going to make it 11 and 15, just enough so that I go through there. And I'm going to stop the sketch. And we're going to extrude this region out. I'm going to go ahead and include that inside section as well. And we're going to go a distance to object. And I'm going to select this inside boss. and notice that it doesn't go down to it. We have to change the to object type to chain faces, and the reason we have to do that is because this first option assumes that the sketch is completely encompassed by the face we're trying to go to. Now if it's not, you want to change the option so that we're cutting this. We're going to say OK. And now you can see that we've cut that boss down and we have just a small amount of material left. Now I will say that this is going to affect the structural integrity just a little bit. So I'm going to edit that feature. And instead of going down that full distance, I'm going to give it a distance amount of minus 20 millimeters. And what this does is it leaves the small wall of this boss here, and it gives us some additional structure. All right, so you can take it down as much as you want. You can take it all the way down to that face, or you can have it recessed just enough so that it encompasses, in our case, the socket head. So if we go down minus 18, again, that'll add a little bit of extra structure for us. So we're going to take that, we're going to fillet this edge. I'm going to go ahead and fillet it at 2 millimeters so it's nice and rounded. And then we want to pattern that feature. So we're going to go to Create, we're going to mirror it, we're going to mirror the feature of this extrude cut as well as this fillet. And in this case, we'll start off by going across the right plane and say OK. Now notice that it doesn't work. And this does happen from time to time depending on how your mirror is set up. If we come back into Create, Mirror, and again we mirror it as a feature, this extrude without the fillet, we select the mirror plane, right plane, and we allow it to optimize. You see that again we're getting an error, and it just tells us that the compute failed. It doesn't like how it intersects the body. So we can go back into the sketch. We can add a vertical line, and we can add a horizontal line. And again, you might have to hold down the control key if there are constraints that it's trying to automatically apply. We'll make this one vertical, make this one horizontal. We'll select them and hit X on the keyboard to turn them into construction. And then we'll create a sketch mirror. So for the sketch mirror, we're going to select all of these entities. And we want to mirror it across this vertical reference line. And if you have just selected this line to turn it into construction, sometimes it'll pre-select it. You're going to have to make sure you turn that off. And then we'll repeat that command. And again, we'll select all 7 lines on each side. And then this time we'll mirror it across here, and we'll say OK. Now when we stop sketch, we simply need to go back into that extrude, and for the profiles, we want to select each of these regions on all 4 corners. So it does happen from time to time where the geometry you have doesn't really make good use of a mirror or a pattern, especially when you're trying to pattern things like a fillet. We'll just go back and we'll add these edges so that we're filleting all 4 of those corners. And now everything is okay. Lastly, we want to make sure that we round these corners off just slightly. We'll give them a 2 millimeter fillet and we'll say OK. So now if we check the properties of the component tray, we've dropped it down almost 10 grams. We've dropped quite a bit of mass off just by modifying those corners. And now we give the propellers a little bit more room and less obstruction. So let's go ahead and minimize everything. We'll activate the top level. We'll select all the components. We'll right click and we'll show. So now let's go ahead and save our file so we can move on to the next step.